I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. So, while most podcasts out there are funded through sponsors or ads, we here at Climate Optimists rely on listener donations to bring you the programming you hear each week. So, if you are a loyal listener and value what you're getting from us, and I know that's a big if, consider a donation that aligns with that value. All you have to do is head over to our website, climateoptimist.co, click that donate button. And as Todd says, no donation is too small or too big.
Well,
Did I misquote you there?
I maybe have said that, but let's be clear. I'd rather it be big.
So with every topic we cover, we try our best to track down answers to what we think are critical questions. And when we did our episode this past fall, focused on climate impacts of beef and related meats, I think at least I came away with a number of additional questions about, kind of the world of meat alternatives. And so with our guest this week, we finally get a chance to answer some of those lingering questions and learn more about, plant-based proteins. So before we get there, I've heard you got a good reason for hope for us this week.
Yeah, so NATO, the world's largest military alliance, just announced climate targets as part of its summit in Madrid. So it has committed to reduce its emissions by at least 45% by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2050, in line with what's needed to stay on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, as we always talk about, which is, obviously a big deal. Of course, individual countries still need to determine what targets to set for their own military. But the announcement, is an additional piece of momentum as Europe's working to accelerate its efforts to decarbonize. The U.S. military is already working to achieve similar targets, which have been set forth by the Biden administration in spring of 2021. So yeah, a big deal. I'm curious to see how, maybe I'm just naive, but like how militaries will be able to do, carbon neutral. And I don't know if there's like some offsetting that will have to take place. I don't know what kind of impact, the air forces of these places, but it seems hard to think that they'd be able to completely go off like fossil fuels, when you're talking about like flying an F-16 or something. But
Totally.
I'm sure there's other ways of doing it. Probably electrifying certain parts of the force that they can.
Yeah, you could see a world where you're electrifying a lot of the, the ground equipment,
Right.
but we're clearly a ways away from having an F-16 that flies on batteries. So,
yeah.
So,
for sure.
yeah, I think you're right. There's going to have to be some biofuels in there, hopefully some sustainable biofuels to take their place.
For sure.
But yeah, exciting announcement nonetheless. I mean, I think all
Yeah.
of these collectively just keep, adding up, and it puts more pressure on countries to kind of ante up. So I think it's a good thing. Well, our guest today is a self-dubbed recovering management consultant. Chris Dennett is the vice president of people and strategy at the Tofurky company, a leading plant-based foods company where he focuses on strategy, corporate planning, people, and organizational design. Prior to joining Tofurky, Chris was a principal consultant at the North Highland Worldwide Consulting Firm, where he designed and led complex projects. He has been a volunteer for the Oregon chapter of Environmental Entrepreneurs since 2008, great organization, and lives in Bend, Oregon, and in his spare time is a big mountain biker, skier, kiteboarder, so clearly keeps himself busy. Chris, welcome to Climate Optimists.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's start off with a basic question that we ask all our guests. When it comes to efforts to address climate change, what makes you hopeful?
I think I would say is our youth and the next generation of consumers. We are seeing that shift even at Tofurky in the marketplace around how people are changing their buying preferences. But also we've got this major demographic coming up behind us who care about climate, and there's enough of them to really move the dial. So I'm really hopeful about our youth and the way that they approach their lives and their purchasing, and civic engagement. I think they're going to make a difference and address climate change in the future.
Yeah, I feel similarly hopeful in that respect, and it's good to hear that, consumer habits are changing because I think we we recognize that the status quo isn't very sustainable. So, just for people's benefit, how did you get into the world of plant-based proteins?
So I work for the Tofurky company in Hood River, Oregon. I'm their VP of People and Strategy, and I knew them from a previous career in management consulting, where they were a client of the firm that I was working for. It was a year-long project, nothing to do with their brand or mission, but really just helping them on their on their journey towards becoming a larger company, and got to know the CEO and many on the senior leadership team, and was blown away at their commitment to their mission, the value and mission based approach to their business, and the fact that they, as a privately held company, could do what they wanted to do in the name of their mission. They didn't have to get permission from somebody else to decide what they wanted to do. So it was one of my favorite projects as one of client projects back in 2015. And then some years later, they got wind of me wanting to make a change, and it worked for both of us. And that's how I ended up at Tofurky. It was serendipitous for all of us. So
Yeah, I suppose that's the world's best job interview, right? Where you get to try them out, they get to try you out, and then at the end, if an opportunity pops up.
exactly, yeah.
Some folks may be aware that obviously, eating plant-based has benefits for both the environment and the climate, but wondering for those who might not be as familiar, what are those benefits, right? How does eating plant-based or plant-based proteins in particular help with climate change?
Yeah. I think a good way to think about it is like what a lot of people understand is like a beef burger patty. There are so many of these eaten by Americans every year. The number is kind of astronomical. Something like, I think the average American eats more than 100 burgers a year, animal protein burgers. And if you compare that to a plant-based burger in the form of water and land and how much carbon is used to produce the product, a plant-based burger, according to the United Nations on environment, it's 87% less water, 94% less land, and ultimately in the end, almost 90% less carbon emissions to produce an equivalent burger patty for your July 4th barbecue burger. So it's just the fact that you're using plant-based ingredients, and you don't have to raise an animal to get them to weight that needs a lot of feed, a lot of water, and a lot of space to get that animal to the size that's needed to harvest that. Then we could talk about the distribution of these products and how they're produced. Plant-based manufacturing, plant-based product manufacturing is very light manufacturing. It's very similar to a bakery. Things are being mixed into doughs. They're put into forms. They're cooked in ovens and pasteurized and put into packaging and then shipped out. So it's a very light manufacturing, not very intensive process. But really, it really starts in the not having to raise an animal like a cow to create the product is really where the climate savings, climate efficiency is in plant-based product.
Yeah, I mean, somewhat familiar with those percentages, but every time I hear them, it's still crazy to think that it's just really a fraction of the resources, water, land, and carbon to get that tasty burger on your plate. So knowing that plant-based proteins are, good for the environment, good for the climate, good for your health, eating more of them is a positive thing. If you're looking kind of at your industry, what are the challenges from taking, plant-based proteins from where they are today to, I don't know, mainstream's the right word, but let's say the predominant type of protein that we're consuming.
Yeah. The problem used to be the vegan and vegetarian consumer groups weren't large enough, and they were really only the ones that were trying it. And then, in the 90s, with heart health, etc., you had that generation of people saying, hey, the doctor saying, hey, you're not doing well. You need to eat less meat. And so people would try, the equivalent. Oh, I looks like a sausage, kind of tastes like it. I'll try that. And that grew from there, and the industry grew, unfortunately, out of a generation of people who had heart health problems, and that grew the pie in the 90s. So people think that companies like Tofurky sell to vegetarians and vegans, and it's actually quite a very small percentage of who buys it. So really, the other people at that time were, because of health reasons, they wanted to try these, at the time were called meat alternatives. And but then it all changed about 20 years ago, where all these new entrants with a lot of money got into it, and the Beyond and Impossibles of the world, who are well funded, together they floated with the old school brands like ourselves. The tide floated all boats. And then the millennials come along, who isn't it's not only about health, it's about purchasing what you believe in, purchasing with values, purchasing products that's going to change systems away from the way that it should be changed to. And so you've got a new demographic of people buying based on their belief system. And for food, it's buying based on animal welfare and climate reasons, in addition to health. So that demographic has switched. However, the same challenges of price and flavor and the way the product behaves, we call it texture and form, color, is still a challenge to the end user. They, despite their purchasing behaviors are more aligned with their values, they still want the product to be how they think it should be, which is very similar to an animal version. And so the challenges today ends up being in our, product development space around how do you continue to make products have the shelf life and be able to last in the fridge, or be able to be frozen in your freezer and then be slacked out and still be the same quality and behave just like that animal burger or that animal sausage. And so it becomes a mix for us at Tofurky. It's a mix of culinary and food science that our R&D team has the challenge of figuring out the next product. All of us deal with the same business problems that any manufacturer has, from procuring all your materials to having enough people to keep your manufacturers going and distributing your product. A unique challenge we have is we've opted to remain private, which allows us to do what we want to do and what we think is right, but means that we always have to be very, resources are always tight, and we have to make the right bets. And versus a lot of these new startups in the food tech space are well funded, and they get to, experiment a lot and buy shelf space. And it's a much more competitive industry than it was 15, 20 years ago. But that's good for the consumer, and that's good for the climate. So we're happy that there's so many more competitors out there. That just means that this industry is growing, and it's the consumer's base is growing, and we're going to make a difference.
So, sounds like you guys have got a lot of challenges on your plate, clearly, but the market is headed in the right direction. If you had to, guess, I mean, where would you say things are going to be, 5 years from now versus where they are today? I mean, what kind of growth are we, you anticipate seeing?
Yeah.
And then along with that, like what's going to have to happen? Is it really figuring out the flavor piece? Is it driving costs down, getting more people to try it?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people listening to this will have a more familiarity with what happened with cow milk and plant-based milk, because that's a more mature segment of the plant-based food world. And if you think of that as a lesson, how many of us are having some kind of nut milk for breakfast or in our coffee, and how many people are still buying milk from a cow, and that, that's an example of where we're headed with plant-based meat category. The entire plant-based foods in the United States sector in 2021 was just over 7 billion.
Wow.
With the plant-based meat section being just about 1.5 billion, and plant-based milk, which is more mature, just being just about 2.5 billion. Then there's cheeses, there's spreads, there's all sorts of categories in that total, where plant-based milk is extremely mature, and then you go into plant-based meat, which is just behind that. Just about 45% of the households in the United States drink or use plant-based milk.
Wow.
Plant-based meat is about 20% of households use plant-based meats. The 3-year growth trend for meat has been 75% growth. It in meat, and in plant-based milk, it was 33%. Long-term forecasts in the United States are that it's going to be projected to be a market size of about $34 billion, with for the total plant-based meat projections being that it's 10% of the quote unquote meat market. So it's not half, but it's a huge industry. And then globally at the same time, it's going to be about 6% of the meat market over the next 10 years. It's a real industry, and it's real based on how the animal protein industry is reacting, being in a defensive posture. And then also, we also know it's on the rise because every grocery store wants to create their plant-based aisle. They're experimenting with where do they put it in the grocery. Do you put plant-based meat in the, in the where the deli meats are? Do you put it in the grocery section? They're experimenting with this, and so it's real, and it's here to stay, and it's growing, and everyone's experimenting with it. That we can't even keep track with of how many people are starting companies with a plant-based product, and that's also has to do with the food scientist schools that are happening around the country. There's a lot more food science schools, and these people are coming and graduating out of these schools, and they're like, I'm going to start a company and try and make something that's going to address the problems in our food system, address the problems in climate, with our health, with supply chain problems. I'm going to create a product that will solve a problem there. And so you've got that combination of scientists, food science specific schools, venture capitalist money, a changing marketplace, and this burning platform to address health, animal welfare, and climate.
Sounds like a good time to be in the plant-based proteins business.
You say it
um,
is, yes.
so sounds like exciting years ahead. And, obviously here at Climate Optimists, we want to see things continue to grow rapidly in that space, given, the impact that animal proteins have on the climate. You talked about kind of the market pieces, right? Having expertise, having money. Is there a legislative side?
Yeah, right now, with it being in the early years, the challenge right now is the same thing that happened in milk, is around labeling. The entrenched incumbent tends to have this theory that people are confused or misled when they pick something off the shelf, that it's soy or almond nut, and they were confused that, like, how did I buy this almond milk and I thought I was buying cow milk? And so that's the theory. And so they march off to their state and federal legislative branches, and they attempt to get laws changed around labeling. And the plant-based milk industry won, and that's why we have the options we have today around plant-based milk. And the cow dairy milk industry is having to reinvent itself. It's struggling, and it's because you can buy a carton of your favorite nut milk, and it doesn't need to be refrigerated until it's opened. It has shelf life. It's versatile. People like the fact that it's not coming from a cow, and it's good. And so now that fight seems to be over. And so now it's all about providing the best product that's accessible at the right price. Now that fight of labeling law has moved to plant-based meats, and you've got the cattle industry, the animal industrial industry are trying to protect uh, their old ways with fighting in the courts or passing laws that protect words like burger or sausage. That can only be something that is grown as an animal and then slaughtered and cannot be used by anybody else. The one law that was passed in 2020 in Louisiana was they called it the Truth in Labeling of Food Products Act, number 273. And along with the Good Food Institute and Animal Legal Defense Fund, Tofurky took them to court. We took them to court and we won. I think the judge said it was impermissible restriction of commercial speech. So we're seeing this in other states, and that's what Tofurky is doing right now. Is we are representing the industry, and we're able to do it because we don't have a holding company or a conglomerate above us that perhaps sells animal protein products. Won't name any
Right.
names, but we're able to go out and represent the industry because we're not going to step on anyone's toes, and that's where the fight is right now. So we, in addition to legislation, we are through our marketing, through our campaigns, trying to persuade our brand loyalists to get involved with the food system.
Yeah, you already you beat me to the punch. I was going to ask, how can folks get involved? And then, as an aside, it's good to hear these court battles are falling, in your favor. Interesting that the traditionalists don't have a lot of faith in the consumer, that they can't tell the difference between a T-bone and a plant-based alternative. But I'll leave that one aside. So, encouraging folks to get involved, understand their food. Are there other things that we as folks that are concerned about climate change can do to help accelerate this adoption of plant-based proteins?
Well, we talked about from a legislative perspective, get involved from a labeling perspective, get involved with whether it's the Good Food Institute or whatever sustainable food system advocate organization that is trying to change our food system for the better, for health, for animals, for climate. Obviously, getting involved in voting, but from a simple terms is if more of the plant-based products that you buy it and ask your grocer to carry it, that's going to create that demand because that's going to create that shelf space that goes, hey, people want this. And that's an easy thing to do. And to do that, you've got to be experimental in your kitchen. I think if people experiment in get to know their food and handle it and make recipes, I think something happens within inside you where you want to know where the food comes. You ask questions. So I think that's where to start. And then if you want something measurable and actionable, set yourself a goal of I'm going to have a meal a week that is nothing but plant-based product. Whether that's produce, vegetables and fruit, legumes and nuts and beans and these kinds of things, or you add a plant-based meat alternative.
Well, I think it's a great ask, and one that enables folks to continue eating things that they're traditionally used to, but venturing out a little bit. I think one day a week seems pretty reasonable to me. Well, just want to say thanks for taking the time to come in and share with us the exciting world of plant-based proteins and all the interesting hurdles you have to get through to make the market more and more mainstream. And yeah, just excited to see where things are 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and what's on those grocery store shelves.
Well, thank you for having me, Jason. This was a a lot of fun talking to you, and yeah, people just need to get out there and try it. Try eating plant-based and know and learn about where your food comes from. Get to know your food.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for all you guys do there at Tofurky.
Thank you.
So Todd, what did you think of the kind of the inside look at plant-based proteins?
Well, the thing that hit home, and this was evident, I think, in our last, podcast we did about meat and plant-based alternatives, was just the huge impact that beef has, and I think he quoted some numbers, and I think they're all about at 90% savings in water and land and carbon, and just the massive difference that beef's kind of in its own category, even in the meat world. Like, obviously, plants are better than meat all around, but beef's kind of in a category of its own. And just if there's a personal choice that people could make, cutting out beef a couple times a week out of your week would be huge. And the other part that staggered me that I didn't really think about before was the milk thing. And I don't know why that never crossed my mind to even think about the plant-based milk and how huge of a market that is. And I didn't realize it was big. He said over 40% of households, which really kind of blew me away. I didn't realize that it was that big. I knew that it was popular, but I didn't know how big it had really gotten. And just
really
kind of relating
mainstream.
Yeah, and relating that story kind of where the plant-based meats are kind of following what happened with milk. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, fingers crossed that's the way it goes, right? I mean, to be clear, like, I eat mostly plant-based, but I will occasionally, on that rare occasion, have a burger, and so
sure,
I want to tread lightly because I know food is a personal choice for folks, but I do think that we should be aware of the impact or the footprint of our food. If we were all raising it ourselves, we'd be very aware. But yeah, I think these numbers certainly put things into context, and as you say, you don't have to give up meat completely. On the contrary, but if we all scale back, it would make a massive difference, not just for climate, but for, these other environmental pieces.
Well, and hey, don't get me wrong. I think I've said it before. Like, I'm a huge fan of like a, ribeye steak. I love that stuff, like it's hard to compete with that. But I do think really, especially in like especially in the ground meat kind of category, you can really make some substitutes that are pretty stellar in some of those categories and sausages.
So, like you, I was kind of staggered by the numbers he, rolled out in terms of number of people who consume, let's say, plant-based milk, and was really, feeling sort of hopeful hearing the growth that they've seen and anticipate seeing in their market.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading that in 2020 that investments in plant-based proteins were up 3 times more than they ever had been in a previous year. There was over $3 billion. But I think, it really all comes down to the efficiency, of producing an animal-based protein.
Right.
I think, as you point out, there's nothing more dramatic than beef. I mean, when you talk about beef from a kilograms of greenhouse gases per kilogram of meat, it's on the order of 70 kilograms. And on that number alone doesn't mean anything. But then when you learn that chicken is only 10 kilograms, and then, beans, another good source of protein, are just 2 kilograms. So it's, it really is an order of magnitude, different in terms of its efficiency. And so then you can see how it has all those cascading impacts in terms of water and land and carbon. And let's not forget about the fact that, like, there's a ton of meat production that takes place in countries like Brazil. And, a lot of that deforestation is being driven by the desire to produce more meat or feedstock for meat.
Yeah, and I'm sure more people will be interested in these kind of plant-based alternatives due to climate, right? You're going to have people who it might be, it's probably going to be their sole reason for jumping into this and making this market grow. I think that's the goal, right? It'll be good for the climate, and it'll be good for these companies that are creating these products.
Yeah, indeed. Fingers crossed. Well, and that's, that leads into the question, we always ask, what can we do? And for this week, want to suggest that if you're not already, eating plant-based at least one day a week, to take Chris's advice and try it out. I think it's pretty easy when it comes to breakfast and lunch. And, when you get around to dinner, you have a favorite recipe, go out and find a meat alternative to substitute.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, Todd, a lot of these are good substitutes and can even be hard to tell.
You'll be surprised, I think.
And, I think the second option again is reach out to your representatives and push for action on climate. I know there was some disheartening news about how Senator Manchin, this one senator from West Virginia is literally holding up climate action by the Congress. But, the reality is there are Republicans out there who understand that it's a problem as well and aren't facing the heat that Senator Manchin is. So I think it, underscores why it's so important for us to be reaching out and putting pressure on those folks, because at the end of the day, who knows if, we need Senator Manchin to pass this stuff. It may end up being, you have a cohort of Republicans who are, brave enough to stand up for what they think is right. So take a moment, call your representative. You can keep it short and sweet and just tell them you're worried about climate change and that they need to take action. Anything to add, Todd?
I think you've taken care of it. I defer to you.
Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks for tuning in. Come back next week when we'll be digging into the topic of climate adaptation. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.